Music and architecture have been classified since the 18th century as temporal and spatial arts. Lessing differentiated between the poet as interpreter of time and the artist as interpreter of space, finding different aesthetic criteria applicable to each. This categorization has yielded many arguments and poses numerous ambiguities. This was especially true in the 20th century, when these categories were challenged in diverse ways. Still, the dichotomy offers some valuable insights into the artistic media of music and architecture.
Performed, so-called real-time music never exists in a whole at any given moment, but unfolds in a linear manner over time,
becoming an entity only in retrospect, in the memory of the listener or performer. On the other hand, reading a musical score is a process closer to perceiving a space as the score, like the space exists as a whole at any given moment, but may be retained by the observer only by a process of observation over time. Music, as it's heard by the listener, is linear in essence. A more supple linearity is inherent in the traditional compositional score, which is composed in frozen time and allows a deliberate suspension of time. The silent reading of a score is similar to experiencing a sequence in space.
The reader chooses the tempo, accentuation, and linearity of the process, and may stop, turn back, return.
When the silent reading of a score is performed, the interpreter must choose one possibility of the numerous ones inherent in the score, as does the person in the space, constructing a particular sequence of experiences from the certain choices offered.
Architecture, in a sense, captures the temporal and spatial concurrently. The work is physically present as a whole at any given moment, and can usually be viewed as such from certain points.
But experiencing the place itself requires an element of time and motion, a gathering of moments on a linear sequence constructed by the person experiencing the space. This is an ever-changing experience that does not relate to a single moment in time. The temporal arts rely on an interpretation, which usually involves a third link, the performer. In the temporal realm, even when the composer or writer also performs, he or she is a vessel of expression that might change from performance to performance, involving layers of interpretation. One might argue that in the construction of a building from a plan, many levels of interpretation are added.
But these would be related more to making and craftsmanship than to artistic interpretation.
One can assert that in spatial art, the artist requires the craftsman to be as technical and faithful to the plan as possible, while in the temporal realm, artistic interpretation is highly regarded and welcomed. Thus, it is the observer experiencing a space, constructing a linear sequence of his own, who is the interpreter of an architectural space, equivalent in this sense to the performer of a temporal work. Lessing made a distinction between the simultaneous conceptions of the spatial art, which he saw as an expression of material beauty, and the successive conception of the temporal, which expresses the abstraction of beauty.
In his discussion of the gaze, which relates to this artist's glance mentioned by Lessing, Norman Ryerson mentions two major distinctions between the spatial and the temporal. The gaze of the painter arrests the flux of phenomena, contemplates the visual field from a vantage point outside the mobility of duration, in an eternal moment of disclosed presence.
The first distinction is that the visual arts capture a single moment in time, while the temporal arts capture the duration, flow, and mobility of being.
The second is that the visual artist's vantage point is that of an outsider,
creating something which is external to him, while the creation of temporal art immerses the artist in his creation and envelops him. Lessing, when speaking of the single moment of time to which art must confine itself by virtue of its material limitations, concludes that the single vantage point is created to be contemplated repeatedly and at length.
Only that which gives free rein to the imagination is effective. The more we see, the more we must be able to imagine. The more we add in our imaginations, the more we must think
we see. Architecture, then, which is often experienced as linear sequences in space, cannot be categorized simply as spatial, but should be considered a spatio-temporal art which integrates, mediates, and provides opportunities to incorporate linear, sequential, and temporal aspects into its experience. Architecture should not be thought of simply as frozen music, but as a fluid, time-based experience. Experience.